Hi, and welcome to JD's Longbox. I'm your host, JD. Late in 1994, I was invited to take a trip to New York City. While exploring Chinatown, I came across a street vendor who was selling comics out of a cardboard box. I was skeptical at first, but I couldn't help myself. I bought 2 of my most prized comic book issues. One of those is still one of the most valuable books in my collection. We'll save that for another episode. Because the other book was Death, the High Cost of Living, issue number 1. In 1994, the Vertigo character of Death was growing in popularity, and this was her first appearance in her very own story. For this episode, we're going to be looking at Death, the High Cost of Living, issues number 1 through 3, published in 1993 by Vertigo, an imprint of DC Comics. The story features the character of Death of the Endless, part of Vertigo's Sandman series. The character was created by Neal Gaiman and Mike Dringenberg. The writer was Neal Gaiman. The pencils were done by Chris Bachelo. Inks by Mark Buckingham. The colorist was Steve Oliff. The story is about Sexton Furnival, a teenage boy who is contemplating suicide. Before he can complete the deed, his mother kicks him out of the apartment so she can clean his room. This starts his 24-hour journey of discovering just how he fits into the world around him. His first stop is to take in a view of the local garbage dump. By chance, or by fate, Sexton falls in the trash where he might have met his death, if he hadn't instead met Dee Dee, a recent orphan who bears a striking resemblance to Death of the Endless. Part 1. Writing. Was the main character's motivation clear? The plot of the story is much in line with the classic film Death Takes a Holiday. In this story, once every 100 years, Death gets to walk among the living for just one day. It isn't until the end of the story when we learn that Dee Dee was meant to act as Death's avatar, and through Dee Dee, Death is able to experience life. This gets a 5. Did the writer make me care about the protagonists and their goals? Through his adventures with Death, Sexton learns to find a new appreciation for life. However, I felt that his change of heart was more of a convenience than a revelation. I would have cared more for the characters if there were actual threats, but you can't really kill Death. And when she loses the most important thing in the universe, she quickly replaces it with a $10 knockoff, sold by a street vendor in New York City. This gets a 5. Did I feel menaced by the antagonists? The antagonists were all brutes, eager to inflict bodily harm on Sexton and Dee Dee. Mad Hetty was frightening because she kept shoving broken glass bottles in people's faces. Though by the end of the first book, Death shows no fear of her and agrees to help her find something that was hidden from her. The blind man is a creepy design, owing more than a little resemblance to Gaiman himself. He beats up his own henchman Theo, but only locks the heroes in a basement. Each of them is threatening at first, but lose their potency to Death's wit and charm. This gets an 8. Were there interesting twists and turns? The only twist was the eucatastrophe at the end, where everything goes Death's way. Along the way, Sexton learns that the people around him give his life meaning. I can't knock Gaiman for this though. I've learned that his style is much more about giving us a panoply of supporting characters, each with their own vices and virtues to nudge the hero along. This gets an 8. Pacing. 3 issues didn't feel long enough to get to know Dee Dee, Death, or see Sexton find a new appreciation for life. This gets a 7. Dialogue. The witch, Mad Hetty, was unintelligible. I'm guessing she was meant to be written with a Cockney accent, but her slang and contractions made it impossible to understand her. Most of the other characters spoke in believable voices. Dee Dee's perky sweetness came off like saccharin to my jaded adult brain, but I remember her being enchanting when I was a teenager. This gets an 8.5. Were the characters interesting? Every scene seemed to introduce a new side character that Dee Dee and Sexton would interact with. They were well-rounded and felt like they had fully developed lives beyond the confines of these comic pages. This shows off Gaiman's talent for creating an abundance of diverse supporting characters. Because every new side character took screen time away from the heroes, I'm giving this an 8.5. Part 2. Pencils. Does the style match the story or genre? Chris Bachalo's art is simultaneously gritty realism and whimsical fairy tale, perfect for an urban fantasy penned by Neal Gaiman. Bachalo's history of portraying teenage characters plays out in his art style. The raw, scratchy line work looks almost unfinished, which is a reflection of the still developing lives of the characters he draws. This gets a 9.5. Is there good storytelling? While Neal Gaiman's prose and dialogue tell most of the story, Chris Bachalo builds the world for that story to unfold in. The best display of Bachalo's storytelling is a scene where 2 characters pass each other on the steps. Their points of view shift as one of them goes up while the other descends. This gets an 8. Line art. Definition isn't one of Bachelo's strong suits, but that's not what draws me to his art. His unique line work and sketchy surrealism is instantly recognizable. This gets a 9. Character designs. Bachelo does a great job of giving us unique looking characters. There's never a generic stock character even in the backgrounds. This makes his world believable. This gets an 8.5. Costumes. Death, or Dee Dee, is unmistakable in every shot with her now trademarked black clothes, ankh necklace, and a cascade of black hair. His design for Sexton eschews the typical goth look of the suicidal teenager and goes for a more grungy slacker look that was in vogue in the mid-90s, possibly channeling a young Kurt Cobain. This gets an 8. Props and scenery. Bachelo's mastery of scenery is on display as he takes us on a tour of New York City, from the city dump to Washington Square to Central Park and everywhere in between. Oftentimes the skyline is a photocopy of the real city, but this is forgivable since it allows him to give extra attention to the surrounding details. His style doesn't just show you a generic cityscape, he shows us New York City as another character of the story. I felt that his props fell short though. In one scene, a Matryoshka doll looks more like a giant mushroom. I'm giving this an 8.5. Panel flow. Bachelo likes to use very boxy panels, giving us multiple angles of the same moment of time. Or conversely, he breaks a large establishing shot into several moments to show us the passage of time over a single shot. His use of panel lines is so ubiquitous to his art style that anytime he breaks the panels or removes them completely really draws attention to itself. This gets an 8.5. Part 3. Inks. Buckingham uses brushes, pens, and occasional splatters of ink. Does the style match the story? Chris Bachelo and Mark Buckingham's work meld seamlessly, and they've worked together on several projects over the years. It's noticeable that Buckingham's inks on Death to High Cost of Living are even more scratchy and splattery than on other books. The uneven lines and rough textures perfectly balance the fantasy with the realism. This gets a 9. Does the line weight add definition, shape, and depth? Buckingham chooses to use splatters and stippling of ink to add details, instead of the dizzying array of crosshatching common from other inkers at the time. His images lack the detail and hard-edged shapes of that era, but take on a grittiness of their own. I'll give this an 8. Could the images stand alone in black and white, or do they need color to make the images clear? My initial instinct was that these images needed color to bring them to life, but then I saw some of the pages in black and white. Buckingham's slick yet gritty line work and competent use of dark and light make for highly detailed pages that are easy to follow without the muddy colors added. This gets a 9. The images in black and white actually set the tone that the storytellers were going for better than the images with color. Which brings us to part 4, colors. Does the color set the right mood? Made at the dawn of the image comics revolution where computerized colors were bold, bright, and in your face, Steve Oliff chooses to keep the color palette flat and muted. Without a progression of color through the story to reflect Sexton's inner angst or his newfound appreciation for life and those around him, the flat tones don't reflect the changing mood of the story. This gets a 7. Is there clean definition and separation? The colors provide just enough separation while reading the page, but nothing really jumps out. At times, the flat color palette leaves the pages looking muddy brown. This is getting a 6. Does the color enhance the overall experience? While the inks do stand well on their own, the color brings another dimension to the art and adds life to the images. And life is what the story is really about. This will get an 8. Overall score. This gets 157 points, or 79%. Final take. Issue number 1 was one of my most prized possessions, partly for the rarity of the comic and partly for my love of the character. I never followed the Sandman comics, but I was captivated by the character of Death almost entirely because of Chris Bachelo's drawings. For a medium that's been dominated by the exploits of superheroes, perhaps my mind wasn't ready for the nuances of Neal Gaiman's writing. I've since enjoyed Neverwhere, Stardust, and American Gods, and this book does show off his ability to craft memorable supporting characters, but in such a short-form format, it left the protagonist looking flat. As I've read and reread the story while preparing for this review, I found that many of the story elements I was missing were in fact there on the page. Perhaps I was looking for something else, or I wanted the story to be something else. There's so many stories that you can do with the character of Death. Being that this was her once in 100 years chance to walk among the living, I think she would have chose to spend her day in another way. Instead, she spends her day with Sexton. He was ungrateful and rude. His suicide letter was more of an angsty teen cry for help. Dee Dee doesn't go on a grand quest or help humanity in some profound way. Instead, she eats an apple, feeds some fish, and spends her day with a broken boy. Her kindness shows us that there are a host of characters around you that you can turn to for support and guidance. And maybe, just maybe, if you learn to lighten up a little bit, you might get a kiss from death. Well, I hope you enjoyed this review. Be sure to like and share with your friends, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, I'm JD, and this box is closed.